Okay, thanks everybody for sticking it out for this talk. This was an amazing panel, and I think there's going to be some great Q&A, so we're going to try and keep it a little tight because I think that things are going to come together quite nicely on their own. That said, I kind of want to take the room down a moment because I feel like the last talk, if anything, was unyieldingly positive. And that was a great thing because we all need things to hope for. And I'm just sorry you might leave this last one feeling a little depressed as we delve into the annals of history. So anyways, we're going to talk about two historic figures in the history of Dungeons and Dragons a little, and I'm going to go into a little there. But first we want to offer the content warning.
So there is some sensitive content later in the talk. We will give another disclaimer slide that looks like this when it gets close, but there are mentions of rape and suicide later in the talk. So if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, we won't be offended if you leave or decide to cover your ears or whatever while we're talking about that. But just as an FYI, when we move on.
All right, and again, we'll come back to the content warning slide when the moment arrives. All right, so we cannot understand games if we do not understand their history. If the knowledge circulating within published manuscripts was used for this tale, we would know mostly of the canny white male entrepreneurs whose innovative spirit laid the foundation for Silicon Valley and the American technological industry. These famous vignettes have been critiqued by game scholar Lane Nooney, who writes, "Our sense of video game history is, quote, all about the boys," as, quote, all about the boys, is the consequence of a certain mode of historical writing, preservation, memory, and temporally specific affective attachments, all of which produce the way we tell the history of video games. But the problems of this narrative go far deeper. They extend also to a historical mode of storytelling that completely obscures all voices, objects, and events that sit at the margins of society. As Steve Jobs famously conned Steve Woz into developing an agile 42 chip prototype of Breakout in 1976 for Atari. Breakout's 1976 for Atari in 1975 in North California. Two young science fiction fans, Lee Gold and Barry Gold, were playing Dungeons and Dragons for the first time in sunny Santa Monica. Later that year, Lee would send 60 copies of her fanzine, Alarms and Excursions, to friends all around the country, beginning the print run of the longest-running Dungeons & Dragons fanzine in history. The articles printed in Alarms and Excursions forever changed the face of gaming, showing how the creative energy of fans could be incorporated into a feedback loop with designers, co-constituting the game industry. Although Lee's life work has been tremendously impactful, in comparison to gaming's dominant narrative, white male entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley, it is all but forgotten. So, the juxtaposition of Gold's cottage publishing endeavors against Job's white-collar trickery showcase several problematic historical narratives. First, it highlights the degree to which history shines a spotlight on the wealthy while neglecting the poor. Jobs, Apple, and Atari receive a disproportionate share of the spotlight because they are history's, quote, winners, right? They are therefore objects of fascination for the general public. Relatedly, this juxtaposition highlights how narratives of the, quote, digital are cloistered and seen as disconnected from narratives of the analog, the other stuff, as if digital technologies were developed in a cultural vacuum. Third, this comparison shifts attention to how the domestic labor of women is often subordinate to the work of men in historical narratives. Gold's domestic work of community building and publishing is left out of the spotlight in favor of a narrative that features a somewhat problematic male anti-hero. Not only is the history of video games all about the boys, as Nooney claims, it is also all about the money and electronics, right? And this is why it's great to have presentations on things like Monster Factory. These things that, even though they might be centered around some men, are also lying outside the dominant man narrative and therefore challenging it. So, anyways, that's some background, and we're going to be digging into Alarms and Excursions, which there's a shot from the zine way over on the right. So let's talk about what we did and what Alarms and Excursions is. Alarms and Excursions was born out of the Los Angeles science fiction zine in 1975. Some friends from San Francisco had driven down to visit Lee and her husband Barry around that time, and during their visit they decided to run a game of the what is now Dungeons & Dragons. Inspired by our experience playing the game, community buzz around the game and other fanzines, and the publishing traditions of science fiction fans, Lee decided to found the fanzine Alarms and Excursions. dedicated to Dungeons and Dragons. And she wrote in the introduction of its first issue that it was a cross between an alternative publishing association, which is a way that fans at the time would go about their publishing, and we can talk about that more later, and a fanzine. Lay's hybrid model is key to understanding both the potency of fan conversation defining the relationship between gamer and game. Because conversations between fans, developers, publishers, and consumers intersect and blur so acutely in Alarms and Excursions, our paradigm for understanding these stakeholders must adapt accordingly. And so I just want to give you some quick tidbits about the background and context of what we did and what Alarms and Excursions is. This is some of the work that Nikki did last summer, looking at the sort of social norms that we coded for, and she can go into those later in Alarms and Excursions. And as you see, at first we found very few instances, and we were looking for moments of opposition, of conflict, and this usually came around sexuality, gender, race, things like that. And so as the publishing grew deeper, by issue 10 we found a lot more than in issue 1. And now here's where it gets interesting. We also coded some issues across the time span of Alarms and Excursion for who is writing, how many women were writing versus how many men, at least how we could identify them in the tables of contents. So this is the first one on the left is issue 6, and here you have almost complete parity between female authors and men. And then in issue 10 you see it gets a little worse. Their list of authors grows to 22, but still there's only 6 women writing. And then let's follow this a little further down the line. Later in 1977 drops to 3 out of 43 authors. In issue 50, 4 out of 33 authors. Issue 75, 2 out of 37 authors. So this is some context for the work we're doing, right? What happens in this publishing story? What happens in the narrative of this magazine's publication, which was, written and published by Lee Gold, who was a woman living in LA, that suddenly we have a moment where gender parity drops off. Everything, all the conditions are right for this to be flourishing, for this to be another space of diversity and representation, and yet somehow that's not what we have. So this is a problem, and we want to talk about some of the microaggressions that might have led to this.
Okay, so starting out, we're going to be talking about 2 character archetypes that were proposed in Alarms and Excursions that kind of exemplify the gender issues that were happening at the time. So that's the Damsel and the Courtesan, as the title implies. And we're going to start out with the Courtesan. So the archetype was proposed by Dick Eney, who was a regular writer in Alarms and Excursions. His weekly or monthly article title was "It's Eney's Fault," which here is kind of really apt because this is super problematic for a lot of reasons. The Courtesan was presented as a subclass of the thief, but was limited only to female characters. At the bottom there you can see kind of the titles for the different levels of courtesan, so as you progress you would get a different title, including things like the Pleasure Wench, and the Temptress, only reaching the level of adventurous at very high level, so that was restricted. Courtesans were hired by the adventuring party to, in quotes, keep company with the adventurers. We'll get into that a little bit later, but that gave them buffs and morale boosts so that they could do better in combat. But the main point for the courtesan was to get money from them in some way. And part of that came through in when they were negotiating what the pay was going to be. So written into the class description for the courtesan is the requirement that they lie and say that they are more experienced than they are in order to trick the party into giving them more money. So there's a lot of really problematic ways to view feminine sexuality and how we're exchanging that as a product and things like that. Additionally, the deception and sexually promiscuous females being deceivers. And so this excerpt also talks about a formula table, basically, that would determine what type of encounters a courtesan was willing to give her party, which Erin will be talking about a little bit later. But overall, the design of the courtesan really embodied these ideas of female promiscuity, deception, and objectification in a lot of ways. And then on the flip side of that, we have the damsel. So the damsel was a response to the courtesan class that was written by Samuel Konkin III in his article Clear Ether. Again, he was a pretty regular writer, and this was his section that he would write in. So the damsels were introduced as lawful courtesans. Basically a possibility intended to be a more positive take on what the courtesan was, because Konkin had said that he did find aspects of the courtesan problematic. So he kind of went in the other direction, but took it way too far. So the character archetype is basically the complete opposite of the courtesan, emphasizing feminine purity and chastity and demureness. And the damsel that Konkin played and was kind of trying out to test if this was going to work was his damsel named Cheerleader. Not joking. That was just her name. So many of the skills that the damsels had kind of mirrored like a Disney princess. So there was things like bonuses against male characters that were smaller than man-sized, like a dwarf, affinity for wildlife critters, and access to magical mirrors. So like that's just Snow White, right, as a D&D character. And then again, before I move on, this is the content warning again. So we're going to talk about a mention of rape and a mention of suicide. So really briefly. Part of the thing about the damsel was that she was supposed to be a lawful courtesan, but a lot of the times when Konkin talked about lawfulness, it seemed to be more about chastity. And so there was a mention at one point here, the importance of the damsel's honor and maintaining honor. Mentioning that in the case of rape, the honorable thing for a damsel to do would be to commit suicide, because she is now no longer pure and honorable. And if she does not kill herself, she's not permitted to progress as a damsel anymore, unless her purity is restored. And so he talked about some alternatives, such as finding wishes, which are very rare abilities in Dungeons and Dragons, and wishing for her virginity back. I see a lot of people shaking their heads. Yes, that was exactly how we felt when we saw this. So he later goes on to mention that he refers to damsels who have lost their ability to progress as damsels as tarnished damsels, and again mentioning different ways that they could restore their purity to continue to progress, which often had to deal with their virginity. So these two articles kind of epitomize the fan discourse around gender. These were like really hot topics. They had a thing where authors could respond to each other, and these two articles had a whole lot of response from people in the community, which Aaron will get to a little bit later. But they kind of hit on several key issues that we started to see reappearing in Alrams and Excursions, which were basically representations of women's sexuality, assumed heteronormativity, like the fact that courtesans and damsels could only be women was something that a lot of people were like, well, why? The strength of masculinity and the fragility of femininity, and the intersection of race and beauty. And these were both characters that really spoke to the intersectional nature of fan discourse at that time around women's issues and gender representation. And I'm going to give this back to Aaron to continue talking about that.
Right. And so, continuing on, I want to talk a little about what it means, and how things like intimacy, as it is related as a game mechanic, relate to this worldview of some of these authors who are publishing for Alarms and Excursions. So first of all, this is the makeout table. So if you're gonna make out with another player, right? You roll a d6, and it kind of tells you what happens. And of course, as we showed you in the earlier slide with the damsel, they add modifiers to that, so it goes further, faster. But interesting also is this idea of free will that you see over here. Player characters having free will may choose to roll twice. If so, they resist seduction by a saving throw on either roll. So this is how free will is portrayed, right? Agency in a sexual encounter. It's not that you have total agency. Your body still might betray you in this game mechanic. Players are still looked at some degree as objects when encountered in this way, but instead they get an extra dice roll to represent free will. You get to roll twice if you choose to resist. And then even more interestingly, are here extra, so that's 2 if you're a player character and you have free will, right? So if you want to interact with a non-player character, they're automatically made an object, and thus they don't have free will. But also, characters of different alignments, which is often code for different religions, are seen to be less attractive or better able to resist the wiles of characters of different alignments. Characters of different humanoid types, which as Dan Gardner pointed out very eloquently, is often code for race. Also has this sort of distance and desire to match and mingle with each other. Different genre, right? So not just human types, but also human versus centaur, right? Like that's an extra dice of resistance. And zoological classes, right? So if you desire something like bestiality, there's another dice that goes into that. So all of these things go into the makeup table, which is actually a codified way for players to interact with each other intimately, right? So having these dice in front of them, between them, this is a way to have those intimate relations. And I just think that's really interesting and telling about how games can mediate that and the sort of biases that get impacted and placed into that moment of mediation. And then just some more notes on the sort of algorithms and abilities that got developed here. I think it's really interesting here to note on the bottom right what it means for non-humans to be damsels, and this is where it gets into a little bit of an intersectional critique, right? So for non-humans to have relations with humans, there's automatically a higher role, a higher score required for that to happen, meaning basically non-humans cannot be as attractive as humans, which is code for non-white players are not attracted, or non-white characters are not as attractive as white characters. Additionally, you have a note on the male damsel. If some group wishes to, quote, go gay and remain lawful, it could be conceivable that a gay damsel could make fourth level and higher toward gay vampires, etc. However, straights will be utterly repelled and immune. And then interestingly, though, lesbian damsels are undetectable unless they deliberately turn off males and hence lose their wiles over them, capital W wiles for some reason, and will gain wiles only over other lesbian females, right? So here you see the codification of race, you see the codification of gender, you see the codification of sexuality, and you see all these things making it into the game mechanics, which then dictate interactions between characters. And so, you know, I don't want to say that this stuff was just embraced by the community. When we think about Dungeons and Dragons, when we think about the game it is, this is a blip on the radar. This is an article in a fanzine that happened to be a very influential fanzine. And it was an article that was, in some ways, contested by the community. Here you have a top quote from Lee Gold, the author of the fanzine, contesting it. Like your damsel character, but I do sort of object to the MCP-ism of it all, particularly the fact that damsel loses honor after rape unless she commits suicide. Now, for those of you not in the know, MCP is 1970s for male chauvinist pig, which is perhaps the MRA of the 1970s. Seems to me that isn't medieval but Victorian mores. So basically, Lee Gold is saying this is anachronistic to do it this way. Yet, you know, there's other players who say this is really, really, really awful. Even Dick Eney contests mandatory suicide after being raped, and seldom thinks of the medieval church as more liberal than fans, but be damned if that isn't the case, right? So he's saying, like, it's weird that we're looking at the medieval church as a better structure of modern relationships in the way that fans are here. And it goes on and on. So these are things that are actively contested and communicated by the fan communities. But it's interesting to note that even through some of this, characters like the slovenly troll, brazen strumpet, cheap trollop, etc. have made their way into the infamous harlot table of Dungeons and Dragons. And if you saw in the beginning, the harlot was one of the ways that the courtesan could level up. So, you know, that's it. There's not really a happy ending to this story as much as it's a tale that should get you thinking about what happens to games and how maybe we got to this place in history. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.